Well, we've been looking at, start off looking at the remnant and the concepts that the Bible presents about that. And then last time in our series, we looked at the war behind the war, that Satan began a war in heaven questioning God's character, and the methods that he used were to try to deceive people. We saw that the word for war was polemos, where we get our word polemics. And so it was a war of words, of concepts, of ideas, where he got a third of the angels to join him in his rebellion. And then he used the same strategies to get our first parents to join him in his rebellion as well. And that he has carried out this war against God, against Christ, against his church throughout history, sometimes just with deceptive concepts, sometimes using force where he's enabled to do so. But he also has his attacks against God's last day church. Let's open our Bibles to Revelation 12:17. Revelation 12, verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So he goes and makes war with God's last day people. That in the New King James says the rest of her offspring. King James says the remnant of her seed. God's last day remnant people. Satan goes and makes war against them. And we looked at the different identifiers of the remnant church. We looked at that the prophetic time periods here in Revelation 12 point to a time when the remnant church would arise. We saw that they keep the commandments of God and they have the testimony of Jesus. What we want to begin looking at now is that Satan attacks each one of these identifiers of the remnant church. And the first one we're going to begin looking at today is that prophetic time period that is laid out here in Revelation 12 that points to the time when the church would arise. And so Satan has used his sophistries, his corrupted ideas to get people to question different aspects about what the Bible says about in these time prophecies. So first, here we have in Revelation 12, verse 6, talks about that the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And then the time period is mentioned again in verse 14. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time, times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So both of these we can see it's talking about the woman going into the wilderness. So what's a woman in Bible prophecy? What does a woman represent? A church. A pure woman represents a pure church. A corrupt woman represents a corrupt church. This is a pure woman, and so she has to go into the wilderness to escape the attacks of the serpent, escape the attacks of Satan. And so it's a time of persecution of the church when the church has to go into hiding. Now we notice that it's mentioned 2 different ways. In verse 6, it said 1,260 days. In verse 14, it talked about a time and times and half a time there. But as we look at the context, it's talking about the same time period. And so that's already a key. Well, we're seeing it stated 2 different ways. And in fact, this time period is mentioned 7 times in the Bible. So it's mentioned 5 times in the book of Revelation and 2 times in the book of Daniel. So we're going to look at all of those. So we've seen 2 of them here in Revelation chapter 12. If we turn back to chapter 11, and we'll start reading with verse 1, but we'll see it mentioned once in verse 2 and once in verse 3. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there, But leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. So here we find another way of stating it, mentioned 42 months, but it's paired with the 1,260 days. So in Revelation 12, we found 1260 paralleled with time, times, and a half a time. And here in Revelation 11, we find the 1,260 days paired with the 42 months. But again, we see it's a period of persecution. So the holy city being trampled for 42 months. God's witnesses prophesying in sackcloth. So again, sackcloth is a sign of mourning, a sign of distress. And so again, this is talking at the same time period once again. And then we find it once more in Revelation in chapter 13, verse 5. Revelation 13, verse 5. And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. And again, in the context, it's talking about power to control and to persecute God's people. So Revelation states it 3 different ways, but it's all talking about the same thing. And we find that also in the book of Daniel. So let's go back to our scripture for today, Daniel 7, verse 25. Daniel 7:25, and he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time. And then the final time we find it is in Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So again, it talks about God's people being persecuted. So the context for all 7 of these is the same. It's a time of oppression for God's people. And so it's stated these 3 different ways. So 3.5 times or years is equal to 42 months, is equal to 1,260 days. And so as we kind of fiddle around with the math comparing these, if you take 1,260 days, divide it by 42 months, that gives you 30 days per month. So that's kind of interesting because we have 30-day months, 31-day months, 28-day months, once every 4 years, a 29-day month, except when it's not leap year because of the schedule that they figured out to keep things in cycle. You divide the 42 months by 12, the 12 months a year, that gives you 3.5 years, time, times, and half a time. And you divide the 1,260 by 3.5, you get 360 days per year. So if we look at how the Hebrews calendar worked, they were on a lunar calendar that they then adjusted to try to keep it in sync with the solar year. Now, in the Islamic world, they use a lunar calendar, but they don't adjust it. And so what happens is it keeps shifting earlier and earlier because 12 lunar months is not as long as 1 solar year. And so, your seasons get out of whack as you do that. And in fact, you may find someone, over the years it can add up. And so you might find someone who, that you'd say they're 80, but they say they're 85 because they don't adjust. And so they end up with more birthdays than what you do because they don't adjust for that a difference between a lunar calendar and the solar calendar. And then the solar calendar is what keeps us in track with the seasons. So the Hebrews, what they would do is, instead of adding 1 day every 4 years the way that we do, Their months were visual lunar months. And so they would sit there and watch for the first crescent of the new moon and then declare that the new month had started. Well, what if it was cloudy? Well, then they would wait an extra day. And, and sometimes, how things are visible and so on. So the length of their months, their actual months, were, it could be 28, 29, 30 days. But again, that's going to be shorter than the solar year. So how did they keep it in sync? Now, later on, after the Babylonian captivity, they followed. Babylon had a schedule, that every so many years they would add an extra month. Well, the Hebrews also added an extra month, but they did it from a practical standpoint. The first month of the year comes in the spring, and at the middle of the month, during the Passover festivities, you had the wave sheaf offering, where they were to offer the first barley sheaf. Well, so when you're coming towards the end of the last month, you go out in the barley field and they would inspect the grain. If it wasn't going to be ready to harvest in a couple of weeks, they knew that they had gotten too early in the season, and so then it was time to add another month. And so the last month was Adar, so they would add second Adar. And then by adding 30 extra days, then you're back in sync with the harvests there. So that's how they would do it. But we see here in these prophetic time periods that they're just working on a sort of a standardized monthly calendar of 30 days, and so you end up with 360 days in a year. And so we find this time prophecy mentioned 7 times. Now, I don't know that of any other prophetic thing, other than if we talk about some event like the second coming of Christ that's mentioned more, but for a specific prophetic time period to be mentioned 7 times, to me that says that God is telling us that's important. I'm going to tell it to you 7 times, I'm going to tell you to it in 3 different forms, but the context is all the same so that we know that you're talking about the same thing. So God wants us to understand this. Now, historically, the church, during the Protestant world and the early Adventist church, has understood that these should be understood that a prophetic day is equal to 1 literal year. So we're talking about a 1260-year time period. And so if you go back and look in early, Adventist writings on this, a lot of times we kind of used more of a, we want a verse that kind of says that, and so we used Numbers 14, verse 34. Numbers chapter 14, verse 34. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. So the context here is that, God had brought Israel out of Egypt. They'd gone to Mount Sinai. Then He'd taken them right to the borders of the Promised Land at Kadesh Barnea. Each tribe selected a spy, so the 12 of them went out to check out the land before they invaded. They come back, they spent 40 days out searching out the land. They come back with their report. Caleb and Joshua said, "We can do this. God will give us this land." The other 10 said, "There's big walled cities, and the people are so big they make us look like insects next to them. There's no way we can take this land." The people chose to listen to the 2 spies. They rebelled against God, and so God said, "Fine. All of you that are 20 years and older are going to die in the wilderness. 40 days you searched it out. Each day will now be represented by a year. 40 years you're going to have to wander in the wilderness. Then I'm going to bring you back again." So there we have a correlation between a day and a year. The other verse is Ezekiel chapter 4. Ezekiel chapter 4, and we'll begin with the 4th verse. "Lie also on your left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their iniquity. For I have laid on you the years of their iniquity according to the number of the days. 390 days, so shall you bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when you have completed them, lie again on your right side, then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have laid it on you a day for each year. So here Ezekiel was to act out a prophecy so that the northern kingdom of Israel had rebelled against him, and so 390 days, so for 390 years, they had been in rebellion against him. He said, you lay on your side for 390 days, and then 40 days for the southern kingdom of Judah. So again, we see there a correlation in the prophetic context between a day and a year. And so he said, okay, so we're saying in Bible prophecy, a day represents a year. But as we've gone along, suddenly we find people outside and inside the church saying, that's kind of just sort of proof texting. And I mean, so are you saying every day in prophecy represents it? Well, no, and we can kind of explain things. But, if we just rely on these proof texts, which do show that there is a connection, but we have to go beyond that. Because some are questioning this whole idea of a day for a year. Well, if we throw out the day for a year, there goes one of our identifying aspects of the remnant church. Of when are they supposed to arise? Well, after 1798, we said. But that's based on taking 1,260 prophetic days, representing 1,260 years. So are there other indicators, rather than just a verse from Numbers and a verse from Ezekiel, that can point to the fact that we are dealing with something other than just normal days here? Well, the first thing we should notice is that all of these are given in a symbolic context. They're all given in the books of Daniel and Revelation, which are called apocalyptic prophecy. And so these are full of all kinds of imagery of beasts and candlesticks and all kinds of strange happenings and things going on. And so the very fact that it's given in a symbolic context could form a hint that maybe we're dealing with symbolic time here rather than just normal time. We see this is distinct from how time periods are mentioned in the classical prophecies, like Jeremiah and Isaiah, or in the historical sections of the Bible, like in Genesis and so on. That as we start comparing them, we see there's a difference to how these time periods are recorded here. So let's look at a few what we might call normal giving of time periods. Let's start in the book of Genesis chapter 6. Genesis 6, verse 3. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So the context here is the judgment that God made upon the people that lived before the flood. And so say, I'm giving them 120 years probation, then the flood is coming. But notice how it's just 120 years. It just said kind of in normal, everyday language. It's said in Hebrew the same way that we would say it in English. Let's go to Genesis 15, verse 13. Genesis 15, verse 13. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. Again, so God tells Abraham, before your children inherit this land, they are going to have to be afflicted for 400 years in a strange land. Again, just given in the same type of everyday language how we would describe a time period. Genesis 41:27. In Genesis 41:27, we find Joseph giving Pharaoh the interpretation of his dream. Let's go ahead and start with verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are 1. Then the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. So again, he said that, that what you saw in prophecy represented is going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Again, stated in this straightforward way, the way that we would. And then finally, let's look at Jeremiah 25:11. Jeremiah 25, verse 11. Oops. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So the kingdom of Judah was to be taken away and deported by Babylon for a 70-year time period. So all of these time periods are stated in the same way that we would talk about any other time. But when we begin to look at these, the biblical time periods of these time prophecies that we've been talking about, they don't tell time the way that we or the Hebrews would tell normal time. So, because, we say, well, 3.5 years, but it's not written 3.5 years. It's written 1 year and 2 years and a half a year. One time times half a time. That wasn't the normal Hebrew way for describing time, just like we wouldn't say 3.5 by saying 1 and 2 and a half. We'd say 3.5. And again, we don't describe longer time periods. Once it's up over a year, we don't describe it in the terms of days or of months. We say, well, it's 1 year or 2 years and 3 months and so many days. Well, the Hebrews did the same thing. In the Bible, they knew how to tell time. So these are odd ways of describing time periods. They're not normal. So you have an odd way of describing time set in a symbolic context that's pointing us to the idea that we are dealing with symbolic time here. So these prophetic days are symbolic of something else. And of course, the whole book of Revelation, we're told, is given in signs and symbols. It says that Jesus sit and signified it. The word signify has sign. We could mispronounce it as signified it, and so it's given in signs and symbols, and that includes the time. The time periods here. And of course, there are other time periods in Daniel and Revelation as well. And if we apply literal time to them, they just don't make sense. So in Daniel 9, we have the 70 weeks. And so the 70 weeks is made up of 3 parts. You have the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, making 69. Then you have the 1 week. So the 69 weeks, or 483 days, if you took that as literal time, that would be less than a year and a half. Well, what was to happen during this time period? Well, it's supposed to begin at the decree to reestablish Jerusalem. And it extends to the Messiah being cut off. Well, without even getting into the exact date that started at this point, if we go to Ezra and Nehemiah, it's quite clear that it started during the Persian time period. And not at the end of the Persian time period. But even if you put it at the very end of the Persian time period, less than 1.5 years is at best going to get you where? Somewhere in the Greek time period. But when was Messiah cut off? Who cut off the Messiah? Who crucified Jesus? The Romans. So you've got to be able to get from Persia to Rome, and less than a year and a half doesn't do that for you. And so basically everyone agrees that this is not talking about literal time here, but yet they'll try to say, but all these other instances in Daniel and Revelation are talking about literal time. But again, as we think about, where did this fall in our stream in the book of Revelation chapter 12? we had the Satan's war. So it begins with what? What is he waiting to do? To try to attack the man-child. The man-child was what? He's destined to rule the nations with the rod of iron. As soon as he's born, he's what? He's caught up to his father. Well, so who's the man-child? Jesus. So it's talking about Satan's wanting to attack Jesus. Then at the end, verse 17, we have Satan's war against the remnant. God's last day people. Then you have this period, so you have, if we think of, let me look at my perspective from, so we have the time of Christ, we have the end times, and then in the middle, are we dealing, a 3.5 year period, kind of, somewhere floating in the last 2,000 years? Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And in fact, we look at some other time periods in Revelation, in I believe it's the church of Smyrna, where it prophesies they would experience persecution for 10 days. Now again, if 10 days was 10 literal days, when we look at the persecution, the various persecutions Christians have faced, 10 days is nothing. Now, if it's a day for a year, 10 years, okay, that's something to talk about. And in fact, we can look at the Diocletian persecution, which did last 10 years. So again, when we start trying to apply these things literally, they don't make a whole lot of sense. But now, if we have attack at the time of Christ, then we have the whole swath of the 2,000 years, the Middle Ages and things that happened then. If we're talking about a day for a year, we have 1,260 years. So now suddenly the big chunk of this between the time of Christ and the end times, suddenly that's now filled up by a 1,260 year period. And as we go back and we look at history, we can see that, and we don't have time to get into all the details about it in this sermon, but Paul predicted there's going to be a falling away that would happen. And we can see that a falling away happened within the church, that the established church became a persecuting power there, and that power was given to them officially by Emperor Justinian. The Western Empire had fallen in 476 AD, and then in the early 500s, Justinian, who was the emperor in the Eastern Roman Empire, which we come later call the Byzantine Empire, he gave the Pope authority, and he said, you're in charge of all the churches, and you have the authority to deal with heretics. Well, what's a heretic?
Someone they don't like.
Well, okay, someone they don't like, that's true, but why don't they like them? What is a heretic? A heretic is someone who doesn't believe like you believe. So the church said, this is what we are going to believe. And so a heretic is someone who says, no, I don't believe that. And so we suddenly find throughout the Middle Ages now millions of people, and you can find different estimates on how many millions. The low estimates are somewhere around 20 to 50 million. The high estimates are a couple of 100 million people throughout the Middle Ages that were put to death because they believed the Bible taught something different than the established church was teaching. And that church and state had been combined together. And whenever church and state are combined together, persecution is the sure result. So Emperor Justinian, I can't remember, I should have jotted down the note of when he made the decree. It was in the 530s, but when he made the decree, there was something preventing that decree from going into effect. Italy, including Rome, was under the control of the Ostrogoths, a Germanic tribe, and they happened to be Arian Christians. It meant that they didn't believe in the Trinity the way that we do. And so the Catholics were Trinitarians, and so they didn't get along with one another. And Justinian had sent his general Belisarius to drive the Ostrogoths out of Italy. And in 538, he broke the Ostrogoth siege of the city of Rome, which allowed the Pope to begin carrying out those functions that Justinian had assigned to him. So the established church, the papal church, began to be able to persecute other Christians who didn't agree with it, starting in 538. So if we go forward 1,260 years, Add 1260 to 538. Where does that bring us? 1798. In 1798, the revolutionary France sent their general Berthier to take the city of Rome. And so he captured Rome, he took the Pope captive, he declared Rome a republic, and he took the Pope back to France as a captive. And the orders were that when the Pope dies, there's not to be a new Pope elected. So the intention was to bring an end to the papacy. And as we find with revolutionary France, we find sort of the foundation of modern Europe happening, that you start having secular states. So the union between church and state is shattered at that point. And so the papal power of the established church can no longer be a persecuting power. It no longer has the power of the state to go burn heretics at the stake. And it's interesting that if you go about a little over 100 years before that, there was a British commentator, English commentator by the name of Drew Cresner. And in 1689, he looked at these time prophecies using the year for a day principle. He said that about the year 1800, the papal power would be brought, persecuting power would be brought to its end. Well, 1798 is about the year 1800. And so, anyway, so that gives us sort of the pragmatic text ahead of time that you can take this prophecy, says this is what it's pointing to, and it turns out that you get it right. And so there are other things that we can look at that tie this in. But there's a lot more than just quoting Numbers 14 and Ezekiel Chapter 4. That there are all kinds of indicators in the prophecies themselves that point to the idea that we're dealing with symbolic time here, and as we work it out, it fits with the day for year, which we see established in those verses, and a number of other concepts in the Hebrew thinking that tied in the idea of days and years there. Oftentimes, Hebrew, when we see it in English, it'll say, they went up year by year. Well, the Hebrew says they went up days to days. And so in the Hebrew mind, there was this connection between days and years and things. We even see that with the sabbatical years. So just as we have 6 working days, then we have the Sabbath during the week. They were to plant and things for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, they were to let all the ground go fallow for that. The year was to have a yearly Sabbath. So in their mind, again, they saw a connection between weekly cycles and yearly cycles. And so this was not a strange thing for the Hebrews to think about. But in modern times, it has become a strange thing for people to think about, apparently. And so they want to say, well, you don't have any biblical basis for the year for a day, and once you get rid of that, you have a problem with the 1,260 days, the 2,300 days, the 70 weeks, and all of these things kind of would tend to fall apart. But again, as we start looking at the actual details that are brought out and how things fit together, we have a solid biblical basis for a day for a year. So our first identifier for that when the remnant church would arrive on the scene sometime after 1798 stands solid. We don't have to question that. Now, Satan has not just done it by getting people to question the day for a year. He's also brought up, where do we apply these time periods at? And I believe next time we'll take a look at that. There are those that want to take these time periods, make them literal time, and some want to set them way back in the past, and some want to put them way down at the future. But which, if you're going to have a literal time period, you've got to kind of set it one place or the other. But as we see that no, these time periods stretch most of the way through the whole middle of everything. And so we're going to look at how Satan has tried to derail us with time prophecies on that by either putting them all fulfilled in the past or putting them only, nothing's happening now, but it's all going to be fulfilled down at the future, which is one of the both of those are kind of popular ways in Christianity today for looking at these time prophecies. But as we take a closer look at those, we'll also see that, again, we have solid biblical ground for the beliefs that we have had on these things.